Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Well, we're already well into it. We hope that you are having as much fun as we are. I just want to make good. It's been great. I want to make a couple of announcements before John comes out with Ocean. I want to thank you all, by the way, who came for Salman Rushdie and Colin McCann last evening. We had an unusual security situation. Obviously, we had to make special arrangements. You were all very patient, and it went quite smoothly. And Salman was absolutely delighted with you as an audience. He said you laughed at all his jokes. It made him very happy. We're going to be in the pavilion now for the rest of the afternoon, or we have live streaming to the Opera House, where it is air-conditioned, okay, and closed captioned if you would like that. I would like to extend a welcome to all of our guests on the lawn out there, those that are at the Argus Theater, and obviously our live streaming group from anywhere in the land. If you haven't already, please visit the Art and Words Gallery. It's pretty amazing. I mean, she has all these, It's Donna Seeger, and she has brought these exquisite handmade artist books and themed sculptures, and you just aren't likely to see this in too many places in the world. It's really, really quite stunning. So you can browse to your heart's content, or she'll give you a tour. And on the lawn, if you would like to have a great personal poem composed on the spot, visit Typewriter Rodeo, and you will go home with a terrific memento. I just want to take the moment to thank all of you, our donors and our pass holders, okay? We could not do this without you. We have no sponsorship. We have you, and this has been the most amazing collaboration for us over 31 years, and we just want you to know how grateful we are. And one of the things that we get to do because of you is to really expand our community engagement. So we get to host students and teachers and librarians as our complimentary guests, and we are particularly excited about what we did in the spring at the schools, where Alejandra Campaverdi came and spent 2 days with the students talking to them about creating their own origin stories. It was terrific, just terrific. And last but not least, we are hosting 8 fellows. These are our future writers and presenters. They may be out there, I hope, in the audience. I can't see you here. Okay. And they're spending the entire weekend with the presenters so that they can, it's our way of trying to inspire them to become the future writers that they hope to become themselves. So, welcome to all of you. God, what a crowd you are. And now it's my pleasure to bring on our literary director, John Burnham Schwartz, who will be in conversation with Ocean Vuong. Thank you.
You got the far chair. All right, what a pleasure. I'm just going to give truly a thumbnail sketch of your life. Don't be alarmed, and then we will dive in. I'm really excited to be here with you. Ocean Vuong immigrated with his family from Vietnam in 1990 when he was 2. They settled in East Hartford, Connecticut, 7 relatives sharing a 1-bedroom apartment. His mother worked long hours in a nail salon, and when Ocean learned to read at 11, he became the first literate member of his family. Then he became the first to attend college, eventually earning an MFA in writing from NYU. In 2016, he published his first poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, which drew immediate attention and acclaim. 2019, his first intimately autobiographical novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, written in the form of letters from a Vietnamese American son to his mother, became a bestseller and led to his being awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant. By every outward measure, he seemingly achieved the American dream as a writer at an astonishingly young age. Then his mother, who never been able to read his books, died of cancer. Another celebrated poetry collection, Time as a Mother, followed. And now we have Ocean's magnificent second novel, The Emperor of Gladness. Would you read that passage we talked about from the book?
Yeah. Oh. Well, thank you so much, John, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is my second time here, and it gets better and better every time. So thank you so much for fostering this community and for having me here to share my work. It's a deep, deep honor. A lot of this book takes place in 2009, mostly because I'm a very slow thinker. Takes me about 16 years, I guess, to figure anything out. But it's haunted by what we now understand as the opioid epidemic. But at that time, we didn't know what was hitting us, and we'd had lunch ladies and teachers overdosing overnight, being on, oxycodone, and so it was kind of being hit by the bubonic plague in a way, and this pharmaceutical slaughter really took out a lot of our adolescence. And so the book is haunted by the place that is swept through by this kind of carnage. And this segment kind of captures that. It's a town where high school kids, having nowhere to go on Friday nights, park their stepfather's trucks in the unlit edges of the Walmart parking lot, drinking Smirnoff out of Poland Spring bottles and blasting Weezer and Lil Wayne until they look down one night to find a baby in their arms and realize they're 30-something and the Walmart hasn't changed except for its logo, brighter now, lending a bluish glow to their time-gaunt faces. It's where fathers in blue jeans flecked with wood stain stand at the edges of football fields, watching their sons steam in the reddened dawn, one hand in their pocket, the other gripping a cup of Dunkin' Donuts. They could be statues for what it means to wait for a boy to crush himself into manhood. And each morning you'd sit on the frost-dusted bleachers, a worn copy of To the Lighthouse on your lap, and watch the players on the field, blue tomahawks shivering on their jerseys, their plastic pads crackling in the mist. And when you turned the page, it would slip right off the binding, flutter through the field, gathering inky blotches through the wet grass until it tangles between the boy's legs and disintegrates under a pair of black cleats. The words, "Gone to ground." That town. Against all odds, we have a library. It used to be an armory that housed a group of runaway slaves en route to Nova Scotia, cause for the bronze statue of Sojourner Truth at the center fountain, 3 years now without water. Across from that statue stands the 4'8" Lego model of a red T-Rex, the pieces glued into permanence. It is the height of a boy named Adam Muncie, who, a few feet away, was crushed by the very school bus that was to pick him up. The driver shit-faced on a handle of Southern Comfort after staying up all night to watch the Patriots win the 2002 Super Bowl. Further up, where the streets widens into Route 4 and the sidewalk crumbles to dust and patches of northern poppy and blue asters spray over the green to your right, you'll find the Colt factory where the founder, Samuel Colt, became one of the wealthiest men in America, selling revolvers to both sides during the Civil War. Now it's a Coca-Cola plant where polished red trucks line the old brick loading bays as the sun slips behind the mountains in the west. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I think that passage just beautifully lays the foundation for so much that the novel's about. This journey that has no destination really, that remains static, and yet, it never leaves the sort of dead-end town or brightens out in some optimistic arc of change, but which nonetheless, in its deeply observed and felt interactions between people and the work they do to survive and the dreams they hold. Carries with it entire lives of suffering, forgiveness, and kindness. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that post-industrial New England town you grew up in, that you've written about since you first started writing, and that in so many ways you still carry with you. And, you know, I'm thinking about your stepdad. I'm thinking about the jobs you've held and the relationships you made through those.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know it then, but I think growing up in New England as a refugee was the quintessential American education, because it's a crowded place, it's cramped, but it's also sparse, it's also old. You know, this is where the American project began, including the bloody eradication, or the attempted eradication of native peoples. Also the abolitionist movement came from there, and also the writers. I was in this shadow of Harriet Beecher Stowe, Emily Dickinson, Hawthorne, Melville. In Hartford itself, you had Mark Twain and Wallace Stevens. And so to me, it was a dizzying and a kaleidoscopic place to be. And I didn't know it had, Connecticut had a kind of stereotype until I left it. When I started to study in New York, and I said, I'm from Connecticut, and everyone said, ooh, fancy. You know, and it's so interesting that you have to leave where you're from to understand how it is perceived. And when I said, what do you mean fancy? And they said, well, you know, private schools, Greenwich, Yale, etc. But it wasn't the Connecticut that I knew. The Connecticut that I knew was populated mostly by immigrants. In downtown Hartford, you have mostly Haitian, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Jamaican immigrants who were allowed to come to this country to work the tobacco fields in Connecticut during World War II, when the labor force was fighting Hitler. And so right away, I found myself in this kind of quintessential American city. And what I found right away was that it was also a kind of container that, particularly for the working poor, the idea of the American dream, the idea of escape was a fantasy. I've watched so many people in my neighborhood and in my own family work the same jobs, drive the same car for 20, 30 years. And it doesn't mean that their life is worthless. It doesn't mean that they failed. You know, it's still a place full of dignity. But I didn't see their stories reflected in novels. And I think I was really skeptical of this idea that the novel had to have ultimate transformation. This is what you learn in craft class, that your characters have to transform. And we love these stories. I love them as much as anyone else. Rags to riches. Guy, you know, boy meets girl, girl meets guy. You know, you find the body, you find the murder. And I think there's this kind of commercial satisfaction. I call it the Scooby-Doo effect, you know. There's two products in the novel. There's the book bounded in paper with the ISBN, and there's a second subtext that we often expect, and that's the payoff, the unmasking of the Scooby-Doo villain, right? And I just thought, gosh, as much as I love those stories, I don't see that reflected in the American life that I saw. I saw stagnation, but enrichment stagnation, not failure, not dooming. You know, so much of American life is quite static, but it doesn't mean that it's doomed. And this was very evident. We talked backstage about this. In the life of my stepdad, you know, here's a man who fled Vietnam on a boat for 8 days. Who knows what he's seen? He's never told us. We knew never to ask. He arrives in Connecticut, and his entire life, working life, for 25 years, he worked for a company called Stanadyne. And he made a single screw. That was his whole job. And it was a screw that went into gas pumps. And when that company closed, he made another screw, a much smaller screw. It was his only skill at that point for Colt. And it was the screw that went into the Colt Magnum. And so to me, it's like, gosh, gas pumps and guns. If that's not an American life, I don't know what is. But as a boy, I watched a man work from 3 p.m. to 12 a.m. Never saw his family. On Saturdays, he would sleep in to recuperate the sleep he lost, and we would just see a tuft of black hair poke out of the blanket in his room. So he was kind of this mythical creature, and for me, I looked at his life and I saw something full of loss. And I told myself, I can't do the same thing. I don't know how I'm going to get out of here, but I can't replicate that. But later, when I became an author, I went home to visit him, and I saw this quintessential image. His uniform hung in the HUD housing apartment that we lived in on a thumbtack. And because we didn't own the apartment, it was very difficult to paint it. You had to get permission, so we didn't really put nails on. A little tiny thumbtack was how he hung his uniform. And it was both, utilitarian, because he would grab it, put it on, go to work, but it was also, I realized, a prize. It was a trophy. And he said, look at my uniform. What does it say on it? Because I had all these books. He said, you think you got books, but look what I've done. The word ngọc, N-G-O-C, is stitched in blue silk on his uniform. And if you asked him, now, did you live out your American dream on your terms? Without batting an eye, he would say yes. Even though for us, my idea of triumph was very different than his. But I learned that at that moment, it was not the American dream that I was interested in, but I was interested in Americans who dream, because it allowed a kind of diffracted myriadness that we can have multiple legible positions of triumph, and all of them are legitimate. And I think for me, that became the North Star for my writing. Multiplicity, openness, and not forcing in a tyrannical way. Because I think for me, sometimes the plot, not always, but it can be a kind of tyrant. It borrows from commercial credos that you have to be useful to me or else you're fired. If you don't serve the company, if you don't bring good and value to the company, you're gone. And sometimes novels in the Western tradition work that way. Characters are asked to always serve the higher being of plot. And I wanted a detour. I wanted the book to look more like a portrait gallery than a roller coaster. And it was reading Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain that gave me the first permission to say, oh gosh, I want my novel to look more like the National Portrait Gallery than this sort of conveyor belt of plot devices.
Do you think your experience, because you worked jobs, hard jobs, you worked in tobacco fields, and then for 3 years you worked at Boston Market, partly, I know, because you didn't want to violate Section 8. If you earn too much money, if you get paid too much, you lose your housing.
Get kicked out, yeah.
But those jobs and those experiences, as we'll see, inform a lot of the world, I think, of this novel. Yeah. And I just wonder what you feel you brought out of those jobs taught you, not just in physical and social ways, but also in terms of how you see your writing.
Oh, thank you. That's a brilliant question. Well, so much of this country is built on the nuclear family, or the idea of it. And sometimes there's eloquent counters to that in the found family. But I think actually what's often not spoken about is the circumstantial family, the family cobbled together around labor. And in fact, one of the foundational texts of fiction in this country is Moby Dick. And that book is about circumstantial family around labor.
Yep.
You have that book is actually very influential to me and very prophetic, I feel, because it is about a multiracial group of people who are in a liminal space, not on land, questing to hunt down this animal, this innocent animal, to light the new world towards self-destructive ends, right? The quest for meaning, existential meaning, the divine, for profit, ends up in a shipwreck. And perhaps we're getting closer to that wreck now more than ever. But the truth of that really stunned me. And I think I was a tobacco harvester when I was 14. And the only reason was because it paid $9.50 an hour. And minimum wage at that time was $7.15. At 15 in Connecticut, you could be a grocery boy. But $9.50 was life-changing money. And I worked mostly with migrant workers. And they were incredibly skilled. And tobacco was a difficult crop itself. It was very dangerous because you would have this thing called a horse. It was a cart with a spear on it. And it was a detachable spear. And you would harvest, and you have to pull the stem very quickly through this blade-like spear. And many of the men very dangerously had their wrists slashed. And so, you would have to stem it, put a tighten on it, and then send them to, I don't know where they went, to be honest. I had to stay on the fields. And you load that up, and then you detach it, and then you load up a tractor with the racks until the tractor fills. Then you go into the shed, and by hand, you raise these heavy, heavy bleeding stalks, this tobacco, and you carry it up to the roofs. And sometimes, I only heard the rumor, but some men would fall. And you would hear like a little yelp, and that was it. You hear a thud, and that was it. They're up over 20, 30 feet in these rafters. But these folks would leave this job, and they would follow the crop. Next week, next month, they would harvest almonds. They would slaughter hogs, And so I realized that labor is actually the identity of this country. Labor and war, which is what this book is about. You try to buy a home or rent an apartment in any state in this country, and right away you have the language of war. It's a it's a pre-war home. This is a post-war revival. Would you like to buy this antebellum farm?
You could do a whole real estate tour.
You mean a former plantation, right? And so I think the difficulty of our memory, and fiction is so important in this, is that so much of this country performs memory, but it's actually amnesia via nostalgia. And that's what Make America Great Again is, because when you ask, well, excuse me, might you elucidate where that again is? It's very nebulous. It performs memory, but it's actually amnesia. And I live in rural Western Massachusetts, and the benefit of that, I live in New England still, and you go out into the hill towns and you meet folks, and I'm very glad to meet folks who vote for Trump and wear that. And sometimes, they come in and they're the laborers. They're the people who fix your roofs, and they wear the hat. And I ask them, it's a very interesting thing. I now have 8 years of this sort of anthropological relationship, and because it's still our community. And I realize that a lot of them are trapped, as many Americans are trapped. And I start to realize that perhaps to be an American is to be trapped in a free country. We are asked again and again to vote for the lesser of two evils. Our tax money that we have no say in gets funneled into nefarious things we never choose. And when I start to ask folks, where is the again? If you'd mind, just entertain me a bit, And I've asked teenagers, all the folks all the way up to their 70s, and almost without fail, it's often they would describe their preteen years. And it's someone very young, they'll say, around 2004. Some people say it's the 80s and 70s. And I realize it's really about nostalgia. And ideologies come in and captures people at their most vulnerable, and then seduce them into a political agenda. And when you're told you can only pick one or two, you know that you're picking a politician that rarely accounts for your beliefs in total. And so in a way, it's this brutal system. And we have a lot more in common, from my experience, than the politics often tell us.
I think one of the most powerful ways you get inside that and sort of turn it inside out is by actually describing the work as it's done and the people who do it. And I will say that in my experience, The Emperor of Gladness is one of the very best novels about work and the people who do the work in this country that I've ever read. And you talked about circumstantial family, that those sort of families and relationships that grow up in outside of the home in ways that we never envisioned or maybe even acknowledged. And this novel, The Emperor of Gladness, is the central relationships are all built around circumstantial family. The first is between the narrator, the protagonist, Hai, a 19-year-old fatherless, queer Vietnamese American, and Grazina, an elderly widow from Lithuania struggling with dementia. And then there's the relationships between Hai and his co-workers at Home Market, which is a restaurant very much in the spirit of Boston Market. And when we first meet Hai, I'm quoting this line because I love it. He's in the midnight of his childhood and a lifetime from first light. And he's on the cusp, the literal edge of taking his own life when a witness, Grazina, interrupts him. It's an act that will lead to him moving into her ramshackle house and becoming her caregiver of sorts. And so the novel begins with an act that's meant to be an ending, but isn't. The story continues. So I guess I wonder, like, what did it mean to you to begin the book this way? And how does Hai's unfinished reckoning to commit suicide or not intersect with your own experience and understanding of life? You know, and here I guess I couldn't help but think about what I know of the story about your uncle.
Yeah, oh. Well, I have a really personal relationship with the tragedy of suicide. I lost 2 friends in high school to it. I lost my uncle in 2012. He was 28, I was 24. And so he was uncle by name, but really we were brothers. We survived the refugee camps together. My first memory of my life is sitting in the curb in Hartford, Connecticut, next to him, eating sour belts out of a paper bag. You know, we had this corner store where probably the last candy store of its kind where, you know, they're all in glass jars and the man takes it and weighs it, you know. And that was the first, remember, that was my Proustian Madeline moment, you know. And when I lost him, he left a letter, and there are many things in the letter that you know, it's just, I won't say, but there's one that I think is quite useful. And he said, I've just had enough. I'm sorry, I've had enough. As if he was pushing away a second plate, right? And I realized, you know, what he was really saying was that I'm tired. And it was the pressure, the powder keg of living in systemic poverty with mental health issues, unaddressed, bipolarism. But I was stunned by that kind of ambivalence. That ambivalence could be a reason. Fatigue could be a reason, because often in our titillating stories and in media, we want either a grand reason to live, divine providence, some great thesis of life, or a grand reason to step away from life. And what really touched me was that it's often fatigue and running into a dead end. But I wanted to start my book there because often when we hear stories in the news about someone who stepped away from the ledge, we often clap when they do. And I wonder always, are we really clapping for them, or are we clapping because we're relieved that society has been restored to its normal, functioning, profitable system? That we don't have to see something so horrible and heinous. And nothing says we are not okay than someone standing at the edge of a bridge. But I felt that the act of suicide at its core is still an act of hope. one does it out of the hope of ending immense suffering. And it's important to at least honor that. And I would go on to say that it's a hopelessly hopeful act. But the reality of many folks who step away from the ledge is that they're stepping back into a corner. And I wanted to launch the book there because I wanted to answer a question that I never got to answer with my uncle who went through with it, which was, what does day 2 look like for someone who steps away from the ledge? What does day 10? What does day 20? How do you go on without hope? You know, God willing, we all get someone stepping away from the ledge, but how do you go on? What is it? What part of life can pull you forward? And in this case, I'm not giving too much away. The boy stands on a rainy night on the edge of the bridge, and he's about to jump, and he sees this 82-year-old woman losing her laundry.
Yeah.
And in this moment of self-abandonment, he cries out in his muscle memory, he says, "Your sheets." And that draws her attention to him, and she knows exactly what's happening right away. And I think for me, that's a quintessential thesis of what I'm trying to get at, is that sometimes we don't choose to live. We forget to die. And maybe that's not the big answer we want, but it's still a legitimate answer. And what happens in the course of this unlikely pair is that he realized that he's actually much more useful to the stranger with dementia than he has ever been to himself. And that for him is enough of a reason to stay in this life a while. And although it's not the dramatic, cinematic reason, it's still a legitimate and sufficient reason to stay in this life. And that crisis of fictive tension, starting a book with someone stepping away from the edge of their life into a corner and asking themselves, how will you go on? That just thrilled me to no end, but it was also my chance to ask a question to the loved ones I lost to suicide I never got to ask, which is, what will tomorrow look like if you choose to go forward?
Yeah. And I think that balance of the vision in your work between sort of the continual facing and returning to the inescapable raw fact of grief in our lives, but then the other side of it too, right, which is the fact of hope, which is or faith also, which is I see in all of your writing, and the myriad acts of caregiving and kindness, many of which no one else ever even sees. They happen sort of in the dark. And I wonder, I know how important your mother was to every aspect of how you came to write and what you've written about. And I know that you've said that this was the first book that you wrote fully from start to finish without her, after her. And I wonder where in this sort of frame of grief and also caregiving and hope and faith you feel your mother sits now for you as you continue to write.
Gosh, when I first was starting out as a writer, I was very skeptical of the universal. Everyone around me was saying, well, the universal is just the center. And the center is conditioned by people in power. You can talk about the wealthy, whiteness, what have you. And in many sense, that's true. But I started to understand as I grew older that the universal exists in a very different way for me. And it's not about this universal truth in the center and that everyone has to kind of assimilate into it to be legible, but that the universal is something that comes actually outside of that center, that flows through us. That art, I think, is just an expression of the universal through idiosyncratic filters called human beings. And the sentence becomes, in many ways, the closest we have to the thumbprint of a personhood, which is why I think writing is so valuable, because what other species has a technology as capacious
as a sentence wherein one's interiority, which is invisible at any given time in the material world, is then absolutely not only legible but felt once read. That I could read a fragment from Sappho 3,000 years ago and still understand the absolute loneliness of all that. And the other part of that is death. Death is the ultimate threshold. It is if there's no truth in the world, death will be the one thing that remains true. We're all headed there. Some of us live as if it doesn't exist. Some of us assumes it doesn't exist all the way to the White House. But I think we ignore it at our own peril. And I think when you watch your mother take her last breath, you know, the whole idea of being a writer or achieving anything or legacy, to me, just was ameliorated instantly. And I start to see my work as a medium to understand suffering rather than a corpus to build a legacy. You know, because that's what you start with, because everyone tells you that's why you write, to be somebody. And that happens anyway, because our world works that way. But when I started to see my mother die, I said, I want to use the sentence to acknowledge death so that life could be lived better. And I think it was also the moment where I realized I'm not a writer. A writer is not a vocation to me, because unlike making a screw, from which every screw you make, the next one, you learn a little bit more about screw making. For my mother, it was making people's hands more beautiful in a nail salon. She got better and better at her job. And I think, unlike that, the writer, you know well as anyone else, you finish a book, it doesn't really help you write another one. Because, the screw looks the same, I don't want to speak for surgeons. I know there's a few here. But I imagine the brain might look pretty similar every time. But the blank page is this mysterious thing. And writing one book doesn't mean you should or could write another. And I've never had a multi-book contract. My family would prefer I do, because you get a little more money that way. But to me, the book is more of a phenomena, a performance. So I don't see myself as a writer. And if I'm done here, that would have been a really, really good life as a writer. But I see myself as a teacher. That is something that I think I can do until my brain doesn't work anymore. Whereas books are, you try your best, you do it, and if nothing else comes, that's okay. Having just one book seems miraculous to me. But being a teacher and fostering and giving young people the capacity and giving them permission to be more of themselves, that is a skill I can replicate every single year where I teach at NYU, as long as they get out of there in 2 years. Otherwise, I'll repeat the same thing, and then I'll be like a broken record. As long as they skedaddle after 2 years, I can keep reinventing the wheel, as you will.
So, thinking of you as a teacher and also the journey that we've been discussing, I'm struck just by the different worlds you inhabit. You grew up among the millions of working poor and the millions of immigrants in this country, all the things that happened to you in relatively very quick fashion, the MacArthur and the awards and becoming a professor. And I just wonder, whether it's inevitably created something of a stark duality for you between, where you came from and the family you care for. And I know you take care of a lot of people in your family, and also the professional and, daily world you daily inhabit with your writing and your teaching and as a public person. And I wonder how that feels and how you think of it and how you manage it.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. To me, they're all vehicles. I tell my students this, yes, submit to the New Yorker, because a lot of people read it. And you work hard, you deserve a lot of people to read your work. You also deserve a nice little check for your labor. But don't believe in the New Yorker as an elite entity that confirms your self-worth, right? It's a great place. It's any publication, MacArthur, what have you. I actually really love that MacArthur genius is in quotes. That's how my family views me. Oh, yeah, genius. So we should keep that. Let's bold the quotes.
It's like if they say so. Yeah.
But what I mean is that you don't want to believe in the hype, but you want to let the hype launch you to new beliefs. And so it's about opportunities and vehicles, and you don't want to reify those things. And again, the New Yorker is where I got my first shot in the slush pile. The great Paul Muldoon. You know, I was skeptical. I was like, do they really read the slush pile? You know, I was like, but lo and behold, I get this email from Mr. Muldoon one day. He said, we love to take this poem. And so you don't want to believe in that, and especially with prizes, because prizes are given to the past. It is not an assessment of who you are in the present. So you believe in the truth of that reification at your own peril. And I remind my students this as well. So everything I see is an opportunity of the work. This too is part of the work. I don't see it as labor. I get to continue the work on the page in the oral tradition. And the oral tradition is just turning the air into a page. And sometimes I prefer this because the revisions come easier. Whereas in this, I have to beg my editor, please let me move that comma. You know, I'm waiting for us to get into another printing so I can move a comma in here. I'm not going to tell you where it is.
All right, noted. So, again, this sense of outside and inside in a way. You write, you know, both your poetry and your novels, I think, feel undeniably personal and intimately true to what is generally known about your life. It's autofiction, whatever one thinks of the term.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe this allows readers to feel that they know you better than they do other authors of other books that they read. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I've heard you say that with each book, I'm quoting you, the work becomes like a photograph of an uncaptured self. Mm-hmm. And that you approach identity, all identity, not as something you know, but as something you're constantly discovering.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're 36 now, and all of the things that we've been discussing are both behind you and with you. And I wonder, and this is true for all of us, trying to get a sense of who we are and where we sit, and as you write these stories, and now you begin to write for yourself, as you've said, how do you envision this identity of yours that you've been writing versus the identity of yours that you're living, and what people seem to think of you?
Oh yeah, so. Well, it's a very it's an American phenomenon, this idea of fame or notoriety, however long it lasts, 15 minutes, an hour. But I think it's been that way. The first celebrity, one could say, was Walt Whitman, right? It was a poet, the most photographed man in the 19th century. But also, you know, you could, on one hand, that's true. On another hand, someone who, you know, was deeply racist in his letters, you know, wanted enslaved people to be freed and then move back to Africa because they would take the labor of young working-class white men. It sounds very familiar, right, where we are now. But also someone who radicalized the poetic line, liberated the line from England's, you know, hold on iambic pentameter, and gave us this open hybrid meditation in which the legacy of which I work on, my colleague at NYU, Claudia Rankin, works on, Terrence Hayes, Lucille Clifton, Langston Hughes. And so both vexations are simultaneously true. And I think that is true of identity too, is that we make the greatest mistake if we think that identity is something that is finished, and that the writer is someone who then translates this sort of finite thing to the rest of the world, because then the writer merely becomes a bridge to an anthropological truth and no longer a person. And so I think for me, it's important to see identity as something I am still discovering, and that I cannot represent anyone else in the categories that is foisted on me. Queer, Asian American, working class. Those are the easy ones. But I'm interested in what are the other ones. Who am I as brother, as failed imperfect vegetarian? Who am I as a teacher? Who am I as a dog lover? There are identities that we don't have words for. Those are alive as well. And so that's why I really resist the idea of writers of color being representations or representation as a project in general, because it's very cheap. We don't ask Faulkner to represent white men, right? And so to me, representation is less interesting. And if me being on the stage or being in the world can do anything, I'm more interested in that if my presence allows for more presences to speak on their terms, that's what I'm after. I want presence rather than representation. I want everyone to be able to find a way. And I, in many sense, am a product of the American social system. Things that we are losing and getting slashed now. I am a welfare kid. I benefited from ESL work, from ESL teachers who were underpaid, working after-school programs to help me acquire this language, which I now wield to make myself and my community legible. I'm the product of the Pell Grant. I'm the product of private scholarships. So in many ways, the parts of this country that many people want to undo and destroy and even think that it's bringing this country down, I am the product of this sort of collective, in a way, social awareness coming from a progressive democratic state of Connecticut. We've had universal health care in Connecticut via Medicare and Medicaid long before it was legislated by President Obama. So and my family benefited from that. And so I think the complications, the paradoxes of all that can all sit simultaneously true. We don't need to solve it. I think we fetishize the expert often in our culture. We want to go to the talk and have someone be an expert to kind of give us this exchange. But I think it's equally important to say, I have not come to terms with the aporia of history. I have not come to terms with the vast contradictions and both the triumphs and toxicities of the American project. I haven't. I would rather ask the people on the board of Raytheon how they come to terms, how they sleep at night, profiting off weapons and destruction. Those are more interesting questions rather than saying to the author, have you come to terms with being a product of war? I tell my students this, saying no is such a powerful thing because it's the first step to saying yes to yourself.
Thank you. It's beautifully put. I have many more questions, but I'm going to sacrifice for the team here and open up for questions because I know many of you have them, and I wouldn't want you to miss. So we have our folks with microphones running around, and please hold your hands very high, and they will make it their way to you. Somebody? Can't see. Really? I could just keep asking because I have no shortage. Someone here? Yes, right there. The white shirt. Here's the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I loved the book so much. I was reading it, and my husband, who's here, was reading The Brothers Karamazov. And so my question is, could you talk about how Hai came to be reading the Brothers Karamazov and how you made that decision?
Thank you so much for that question. Well, the Brothers Karamazov is and Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is a thread through the story. And what I found really interesting about Dostoevsky's work, particularly in the American context, because he has a different reputation here than he does in Russia. In Russia, he's kind of a mystic and someone they're obliged to read and move on with in a way. He's closer to religion there, whereas here he's seen as a philosopher, a literary titan, and what have you. But what I was really interested in Dostoevsky was that the absolute sincerity and the grandeur of the questions that he asks. And I found it incongruent with the writing workshop culture that I found myself foisted in as a young writer in America, where, Dostoevsky asks questions like, what is the role of goodness in a corrupt state, in brotherly, fraternal greed? What is the role of religion if it is so easily corrupted by the state, by the church, and even amongst one's family? What is the Russian soul? What is the national soul when moral degradation and crises are rotted to the core? And if you were to ask, someone on a panel to answer, at an American conference or even in a writing workshop, and you said something like, I want to understand the American soul, people would snicker, right? There's a kind of embarrassment with earnestness and sincerity in this culture, in our culture. And there's a good reason for it, right? I think because cynicism is often misread as intelligence. And cynicism becomes a very powerful tool in our culture because mostly through advertising language. We are, as a people, have been inundated by advertising that tells us we are not good enough, we're not wearing the right clothes, we don't live in the right place, we don't drive the right car, we might not have the right skin tone. And then in the evening, in opinion shows, in talking heads, the gear shifts. So the whole day you're told you're not good enough, and then about 8 to 10 p.m., there's these programs on both sides of the aisle that does something very, very interesting that I've noticed, and I've noticed this as a teacher, is it wields humiliation as a rhetorical device. So you watch these shows, and what it basically says is there's a wink between the host and the viewer, is that you and I both know that you're smarter than half of this other group on the other side, and aren't they idiots? Look at them on the right, they don't even know where Hawaii is. Look at them on the left with their blue hair, they don't know what they want, they're just crybabies in their privilege. And there's this kind of wink. And what it does is that it uplifts this battered persona, this battered citizen, and says, you are the smartest person in the room. And if you told a therapist this, say, I live with someone who all day says I'm horrible, and then for 2 hours at night says I'm the best thing they've ever seen, I'm smarter than half of the country, the therapist would immediately say, you need to get the hell out. You are in an abusive relationship. So I think as a people, we exist in a linguistic system of abuse that comes out of our media and our television. And so what happens? The most powerful thing you can do is to be disassociated, unaffected, cynical. And the art critic John Berger talks very brilliantly about this. He says the supermodel's gaze never looks at the viewer. It looks beyond the viewer in the advertising. Because that gaze is the gaze of power. It's the gaze of absolute knowledge. It's unaffected. It's disassociated. It's no longer invested in you because it's seen it all. It's the gaze of performed boredom, right? What more powerful thing you can do in a culture in which you are in an onslaught of seduction? We are seduced to vote a certain way. We are seduced to pay a certain way. We are seduced to act a certain way. And so to then be cynical is suddenly to be absolutely unmoved. And unmoved means you've seen it all. You're too smart to be committed. And so in our culture, the fool is the one who is the believer. And the worst thing we can be in an American context is a fool. Right? It's the worst thing. And I noticed this as a teacher. Early on, this is my 11th year teaching. And early on in my career, I would hear my students use this tool of humiliation that they've already developed long before they enter the classroom. And you see that they would support their ideas or delivered via humiliation. They'll say things like, oh, this line is so sentimental, I can hear the violins. Oh, this is so personal, you're better off writing a memoir than a poem. Right? And interestingly enough, when they deliver it via humiliation, everyone in the class nods. They agree. And it reminds me of those talking head shows. And I said, oh, it doesn't matter the substance of the thought. If you can humiliate someone with that thought, then everyone agrees that there's a fool in the room that deserves humiliation, and the thought suddenly becomes legitimate. So I stopped it right away. And I said, no. As your professor, I cannot let you sell yourself short and use this flimsy rhetorical device. If you have an idea, you must support your ideas with more ideas. I challenge you to support your ideas with ideas, because you owe it to yourself, your peers, and your vocation. And the interesting thing is that when I did that, when I allowed sincerity and earnestness to enter the room, there was a breath of fresh air. They all realized they all wanted this, but they were so scared to look like a fool. And somebody who is earnest and sincere is somebody who believes in something, is somebody who went forth, has gone all in with effort. And we have sadly made effort embarrassing. Meanwhile, our students are deeply hungry to ask the big questions like Dostoevsky did. They are starving for it, but they are embarrassed to perform it in the room, and so they hide it. And I think what I've found really unsettling is that as a teacher, we have made it shameful for our students to try. And we have turned effort into a taboo. And this comes out of this word called cringe culture. So when you open that up and you allow them to go forward and ask big questions like Dostoevsky did, you realize they all wanted to do it, but they were just afraid to do so. I believe Americans, and I don't want to speak for the country, I don't know the country, I know just my experience of it. I do believe, however, that we are not immune to earnestness and sincerity. We are just embarrassed when it's in the room. We actually deeply hunger for it. And this is no less true when we realize the best-selling book at any given year in this country is the Bible, perhaps the most sincere text, which is probably why we love Dostoevsky. We want sincerity and earnestness from the dead, but we don't want it in the room because it's too embarrassing, right? Oh, you want to write a book that solves the soul of the country? Meanwhile, that's what Whitman did. Whitman said, I want to write a book that preserves the Union. If you say that now at AWP, people will think you're crazy, right? But I think giving that, why Dostoevsky is important to me is that he gave himself permission to ask the embarrassing existential question, even when it was intolerable, even in his time. Because again, Tolstoy was the more rational, better writer, even keel. And Dostoevsky was the unhinged, sentimental moralist, right? But I think between both poles, it's healthy to have that balance, and which is why he's an important writer to me, and a writer that I used to remind my own students that you should, not only that you can, but you should ask the big, embarrassing questions. And it's up to the teacher to allow that question to be performed without the fear of being a fool.
Somewhere Dostoevsky is smiling on you. I'm telling you that we are out of time. But Ocean, can't thank you enough for being here, for your work. And thank you all.
Thank you.